Chairing the second session this afternoon is our own Dr. Kelly Shannon, assistant professor here in our history department. We're equally delighted to have her as we were to have Evan earlier this morning. Dr. Shannon specializes in the U.S. foreign policy and human rights. She is the inaugural faculty fellow for FAU's Peace, Justice, and Human Rights Initiative. And she's currently working on a manuscript under consideration for the University of Pennsylvania Press, Veiled Intentions, Islam Women, Human Rights, and U.S. Foreign Policy since 1979. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Shannon.
Welcome, and thank you all for coming today to this very wonderful event. We have a whole panel of very talented historians for you. Our first speaker on the panel entitled Sectors is Pamela Laird. Her presentation will be entitled Parallel Ladders to the Glass Ceiling, Presidential and Corporate Executive Appointments. Pamela Laird chairs the University of Colorado Denver History Department and is a former president of the Business History Conference. Her presentation today builds on, but extends beyond, the work of her prize-winning second book, Pull, Networking and Success Since Benjamin Franklin, published by Harvard University Press. Our second speaker, Allison Elias, is giving a presentation entitled 9 to 5, Affirmative Action and the Legality of Occupational Segregation. Allison Elias holds a PhD in history from the University of Virginia. She is a visiting assistant professor in the Department of Labor Relations, Law, and History at the Cornell ILR School. Her research interests are gender and work, women's leadership development, and ideas of success in American society. She is writing a book about the contested meanings of workplace feminism in U.S. corporations from the 1960s through 1990s. Our third presenter, Sean Venata, is giving a talk entitled Think of It as Money, Executive Stewardship of America's Credit Card Economy. Sean Venata is a PhD candidate in history at Princeton University, where he's completing a dissertation about the politics and policy behind the rise of the credit card industry in the post-war United States. His writing has appeared in academic publications like the Business History Review and through popular outlets like Bloomberg.com and The American Interest. Our fourth presenter, Andrew McGee, is presenting on Computerizing America, Presidents, Business, and Politics in a Digital Age. Andrew Mead McGee is a doctoral candidate in history at the University of Virginia, where he is also employed as a professional research staffer at the Darden School of Business. A past Tomasz Fellow at the Charles Babbage Institute, he currently holds a National Dissertation Year Fellowship from the Truman Library. His dissertation, Mainframing America, is a political history of the computer in the United States from the 1940s to the 1980s. And finally is Paula Gajewski, and she will be presenting on the President, Financial Planning, and American Retirement Planning. Paula Gajewski will receive her PhD from Vanderbilt University this May, so congratulations. She holds degrees in history and finance from Florida State, go Florida, although a rival, so yeah. And earned an MBA from the Moore School at the University of South Carolina. Her research investigates the place of money and the role of financial markets in 20th century everyday life. Her dissertation is titled The New York Stock Exchange and the Transformation of Retirement in America, which explains the disappearance of the traditional retirement pension since the 1970s. So all of our panelists will present, and there will be a Q&A period to follow, so please hold all questions until that period, and we will then open it up for discussion with the audience. Thank you.
Hello, good afternoon, and thanks everybody. FAU turns out to be a fabulous host, and everybody here has been wonderful. And thanks especially to the Larkin family for sponsoring this event. Despite, are we going? There we go. Despite American ideals, there turns out, you won't be surprised to hear, that there are barriers to success that have nothing to do with individual talents and hard work. Since the Civil Rights Movement and the Women's Movement, and particularly since the Civil Rights Act of 1964, many of the barriers that once were brick have turned to glass. This afternoon, I will compare the glass ceilings in presidential cabinets and in large corporations, and why some of those glass ceilings have cracked more easily than others. Now, when we think of the glass ceiling and we think of conquering the glass ceiling, this is the kind of image that often comes to mind. But it actually only works to crack the glass ceiling from below in cartoons and Hollywood, which is kind of the same thing, I guess. And so it turns out that the only way to conquer a glass ceiling is to get pulled from above. It simply can't be crashed through from below. And so one of the phenomena that we see with this, is that okay? Yes. Is that it's really important to get onto ladders. But it really matters what ladders people get onto. There are short ladders and there are tall ladders. And the short ladders tend to be things in politics, for example, and in corporations having to do with health, human resources, education, working conditions, as opposed to tall ladders that are about core functions of corporations, often called line, as opposed to staff functions on the shorter ladders. And those in business tend to be related to production, marketing, finance. In government, federal government, the tall ladders have to do with international relations, defense, and of course legislation. And so traditionally, women migrated to short ladders. It was pretty risky to get on a tall ladder, particularly if gatekeepers were not inclined to pull women up those tall ladders. And so this is a story about presidents and corporations and their roles as gatekeepers and what a difference it makes if they take on a role of mentoring as opposed to excluding women. Now, Catherine Hudson, when in the 1970s, she understood this difference between tall ladders and short ladders, and she said that her target in business was to be the first woman corporate officer in a job that was not okay for a woman to be in. And she then went on to say, well, what are those? The ones that she didn't want to be on were not human resources, not public relations, and not advertising. So she went into communication and became the chief information officer at Kodak by 1988. And by the early 90s, she found that her mentors were leaving Kodak, and there was nobody left to pull her up. The glass ceiling turned to brick, and she left. And she went to Brady Corporation, where in a matter of 7 years, she tripled their profits. So if we look at a pie chart here, just going by the numbers, if we look at Fortune 500 companies in 2015, 23 out of 500 of those companies had women CEOs. That's 4.6%, even though 37% of lower and mid-management positions in those same companies were staffed by women. One of the things that's interesting about this is what ladders those women had been on. So if we see, of those 23 women who were CEOs of Fortune 500 companies in 2015, 20 of them began their careers on core ladders. They were engineers, they were scientists, they were chemists, they worked in finance, they worked in investment, and so on. Marketing, you get the picture. The other 3 also spent a lot of their careers on core ladders. So there are no women who were essentially human relations, standard roles for women. Now, on the presidential side of the story, this cracking of glass ceilings began in 1933 with Franklin Roosevelt appointing Frances Perkins as his Secretary of Labor. This was the first time a woman was in the cabinet, the first time a woman was in line for presidential succession, although pretty far down the list, of course. And Roosevelt understood that one of the things that she brought to this job was, of course, her international reputation as a reformer and someone working on human welfare issues, but also 1933. This is a very short period of time after women gained the vote. And this made it possible for her to bring political capital as well as human capital into the White House. Just one thing about the Madam Secretary, when people asked her, what do you want us to call you? She didn't want it to be Miss Secretary or Mrs. Secretary, so Madam Secretary. Just a little factoid there. So we're going to fast forward here and skip right through Dwight Eisenhower's appointing of Oveta Hobby as the Secretary for Health, Education, and Welfare in 1953, but move to Richard Nixon. And Richard Nixon is an interesting person in this history because even though once he became president, he did not appoint any women to his cabinet, he turns out to have been a gatekeeper who was really an advocate for pulling women onto tall ladders. Now, of course, he didn't do this necessarily by personal inclination, but rather this was the beginnings of the women's movement. And this is a letter that he wrote to a woman, Margaret Garrity, in 1961, and he said, "You have certainly proved that a woman can handle a top executive assignment with as much and many times more effectiveness than a man." Now, you know, we're inclined to snicker at that now, but this is high praise. This is 1961. This is really important, and it's just what women needed to achieve. At the same time, he tried early in his presidency to bring women into executive positions and wasn't doing very well. So he brought in Barbara Franklin in 1971 to recruit women. Her title was Staff Assistant to the President for Executive Manpower. That title changed pretty quickly. It wasn't quite with the program yet. She was a very impressive woman in the first class at the Harvard Business School that admitted women into the MBA program. And he also, that same year, circulated a memorandum for the heads of executive departments and agendas to recruit women and said, I want to report in the White House every month on what kind of progress you're making. And one of the things that's really interesting about this is that he tripled the number of women in top executive positions that John Kennedy had appointed. Barbara Franklin was also a co-founder with Elizabeth Hanford, then later Elizabeth Hanford Dole, of the Executive Women in Government, a networking organization that's still going. And in 1992, under George H.W. Bush, Barbara Franklin became Secretary of Commerce. Nixon welcomed women in the White House into the Oval Office in many capacities. The woman sitting next to him is Helen Bentley, author of a report on women in government, in which she said, among other things, the pace of appointments of women to high federal positions should be accelerated and avoiding, notice, the so-called distaff area. She also said President Nixon should urge the private sector to follow suit and that women should be brought into, that is, pulled, the dynamics of policy development. And the fact that gatekeepers matter was evidenced by his success in pulling women into these roles. Interestingly, in terms of political capital and the different incentives that business people have from politicians, John Ehrlichman, well known as a famous liberal, advised Nixon to, he said, politically this, that is, women, bringing women into government, is a golden opportunity to champion female equality. And so he was thinking of it in terms of the votes. I don't really know what Nixon was thinking about it, but he seems to be pretty comfortable in these situations. So fast forward again. This image from a Wall Street Journal special section on women in 1986 makes the point that, about the glass ceiling, thank you, that up to a certain point, brains and competence worked and barriers against women set in. And basically the point is that, the next quote, that this Glass ceiling often happens when a woman approaches a key managerial position where she'll affect company policy. And of course, company policy is what government positions are all about. Elizabeth Dole is a hero of this story. She was the first female Secretary of Transportation under President Reagan, and she became George H.W. Bush's Secretary of Labor in 1989, and she initiated the glass ceiling project, and she said, "I made this issue a top priority. For me, it is a matter of fairness and equity born out of personal experience." That same year, 1990, if we compare cabinet secretaries to CEOs, we see that there were 3 out of 500 Fortune 500 CEOs, and all of them own major stakes in their companies. So there were none who were pulled up. The presidential cabinet had 1, that is Elizabeth Dole. 1 out of 14 isn't a lot, but it's 7%. So why the difference? Different incentives. Corporations are about growing profits, and presidential politics are about political capital. So there's a lot to be said for this difference. If we jump ahead to 2015, Fortune 500 lists 23 women as CEOs, still 4.6%, whereas President Obama's cabinet appointees since 2009 have been about 25%. And he's just a scooch above that in the president cabinet. And again, different incentives. If we look at the percentages, and you can sort of get a sense of what's been going on. Since President Carter, every president has had at least 3 women in his cabinet, or beginning with President Carter. If we look at the numbers of female cabinet secretaries in health and social service departments, it's 2/3, again, not doing real well and cracking those glass ceilings. If we look at the presidential non-traditional appointees since 1993, and I don't have the time to run through this whole list, but basically Bill Clinton appointed 5 women, and 3 of them were glass ceiling breakers. George W. Bush appointed 6 women, and many of those broke glass ceilings. Barack Obama has done very well also. And there are 3 glass ceilings in the cabinet yet to be broken, and we could all bet about which one that's going to be. So, looking at the importance of changing ladders, some of you may remember the 1992 presidential campaign when Barbara Bush and Hillary Clinton competed on their chocolate chip cookie recipes. And even as First Lady, Hillary Clinton's big project was about health care, again, a traditional ladder. Now, of course, she is in a different role and much more of a core in international policy. Finally, to conclude, I thought I'd tie this again together with business and just give you a chance to see some ideas from Eileen Gordon, who's the CEO of Ingredient, which is the largest company you've never heard of, and it's basically food ingredients, probably things we shouldn't be eating, but that's neither here nor there. She, in 2013, she was interviewed and said, a lot of women go into staff roles, but a mentor said, you should run a company. You have the abilities to run a company. And he told her to leave the safe staff role and go into line management. Most women would like that chance. And this is a woman with a degree from MIT. And her advice is to get your hands dirty. Now, of course, that means something different in politics than it does in business. But basically, her point is that gatekeepers care about what people do that affects the bottom line. What are their core issues? And that's what women need to do, and gatekeepers need to appreciate it and recognize that when they do it. Thank you.
afternoon. Thanks so much for coming. So excited to be here. Thank you to FAU for inviting me and to the Larkin family. Today I want to talk about gender and work. It intersects really nicely with what Pam has started our discussion here. My main point today is to show that affirmative action actually failed to change occupational structures significantly. And the reason this is important is that we now find ourselves somewhat stalled at a gender revolution where women have reached a certain point in management, but there has been a slowdown of occupational integration. There's also been a slowdown in the past few decades of closing the gender wage gap. So I want to look at, with an increasing number of women serving as primary roles as breadwinners or, main earners for their families, how do women's jobs end up being such low-paid work still, despite the gains of the feminist revolution in the workplace? So we want to think about affirmative action as part of a history of executive orders that have had a lot of significance. So here's, Abraham Lincoln signing the Emancipation Proclamation, an early executive order. We also get a really significant executive order in the ordering of Japanese Americans into camps with Executive Order 9066, Japanese internment. And then in 2001, another executive order of note was President Bush, weeks or maybe a month after the 9/11 attacks, creating a Department of Homeland Security. So today I'm really looking at the executive orders known as affirmative action and the kind of implementation and enforcement that was beneficial or not so beneficial to women. So really affirmative action is kind of part of a history of executive orders regarding discrimination in the workplace, but particularly regarding racial discrimination. So early on, a lot of scholars think maybe affirmative action can be traced back to during World War II when Roosevelt bans racial segregations in federal jobs for the mobilization effort. Then we get President Truman banning racial segregation in the military among the Army and military branches. JFK is sort of the first to use the terms affirmative action, that employers that had government contracts need to take affirmative action to remedy past racial discrimination. And then what really is now known as affirmative action came from LBJ, and he strengthened the mandate that JFK issued, and then a few years later added sex as a protected category within affirmative action, which had traditionally been based on race or ethnicity or skin color. So again, the affirmative action has had widespread changes in the workplace, but also in higher education to try to increase the number of people who are qualified for certain jobs in the workplace. I'm going to concentrate just on the workplace today, not on higher education. And I would say LBJ, with issuing affirmative action, really had the intention of trying to address inequality. And he saw inequality as not just inequality of opportunity, but trying to also remedy inequality of results. And so this quote here, you do not take a person who for years has been hobbled by chains and liberate him, bring him up to the starting line of a race, and then say, you are free to compete with all the others, and still justly believe that you have been completely fair. So this is a quote LBJ gave at Howard University during a commencement speech a few months before he issued Executive Order 11246. And so we can see here that LBJ thought that freedom was not enough, that sort of actions needed to be taken. The government had to mandate that private firms that had government contracts actually try to make sure equality was a result, not just a theory or something as a goal. Now, I want to bring up something that Pam brought up, and that would be that in the 1970s, as many of you know, men and women worked on very different job ladders. So sociologists have studied this extensively and talked about how when looking at occupational segregation, you really have to look at the way men and women are assigned to different job ladders. And, you know, there's a gendered structure to these internal labor markets that really prevents women from being able to move to male-dominated job ladders and be able to, you know, gain the highest salaries and have higher status jobs. And really, there's obviously a history behind why gender plays such a big role in internal labor markets. We don't really have time to go into it today, but a lot of it has to do with the family wage ideal, or the idea that women are sort of more temporary or supplemental earners and not primary earners. And so they can work in jobs that are more transient or can be entered and exited more easily. So I also want to bring into this talk the idea that, well, the reason I have, I didn't explain the racetrack. So the LBJ quote about, you know, we have to make sure, you know, everyone is, has a, you know, that some people have a head start on the racetrack. And so I would argue that actually because men and women were on different tracks, literally running in different races, the way affirmative action was implemented and enforced didn't actually remedy a lot of the problems that women faced in the workplace. And so I have these depictions of men and women on separate job ladders. So now let's bring in some labor organizing efforts in the 1970s to try to improve the rights and respect that women had in the workplace. One of the main organizations was 9 to 5, which started in Boston in 1973, but then became a national organization known as the National Association of Working Women. And one of the co-founders was Karen Nussbaum, who would later go into the Clinton administration as the head of the Women's Bureau there. So this is a picture of Karen Nussbaum at a rally, and basically she and her allies argued that women deserved higher pay, they deserved more respect for their jobs in clerical work, and this group was trying to challenge the norms about the boss-secretary relationship and about the fact that women's jobs were, as Pam would put it, not core to the strategy of the business or the profit maximization of the business. So one of the goals that 9 to 5 had was to bridge these different job ladders, that experience on a job ladder for women, experience in clerical work, should constitute experience to move over to the male-dominated ladder. So they thought that there should be more value placed on clerical experience as training grounds for management. So you might know 9 to 5 from the movie with Dolly Parton that came out in the 1980s. It was one of the top grossing movies, and so this movie 9 to 5 is actually based on this labor organization that Jane Fonda was active in, and so she was the one that initiated the making of the movie. So now getting back to affirmative action, you know, there's a lot of questions around how this is going to be implemented in the workplace. And so these questions include things like, how would affirmative action function on the ground? So it's really broad language. What's this going to mean for employers and policymakers? How are you going to target discrimination? Who within the firm is going to be responsible for implementing certain practices? And this really leads to growth in human resource departments, as some scholars have written about. And then what exactly are government contractors going to be required to do in order to meet the mandates? If there's a compliance review, what are regulators really looking for? And how will the government actually follow the law? You know, what are the standard bars that need to be met? Are there going to be specific number goals? Is it based on good intentions? Well, I would argue that what happened was in the early 1970s, President Nixon explained affirmative action as being a goals and timetables approach. And what this means was that employers should make a good faith effort to reach numerical targets, and these numerical targets were going to be set based on the number of minorities or women in certain internal categories in the occupations, and then that would be compared to the number of women and minorities available or interested in certain jobs in the surrounding population, which could mean a more regional population or a national population. Well, I would argue that the job categories within the firms were quite arbitrary. So employers were creating job categories in ways that might inflate people's titles so that more women were put into managerial categories. These job categories were hardly ever based on salary or income. They were really based on job description and job title. And so, so this was one way employers really didn't bring about significant change, because the job categories they created to compare to outside feeder pools were quite arbitrary. And also, when thinking about the outside feeder pools when determining statistical parity, employers also had a lot of discretion over determining these feeder pools. So who's going to be part of the larger population to be compared to these internal categories? And I would argue that a lot of times employers did not consider people with potential to do a job. It was really people who automatically already had that training. And then also employers, a lot of HR literature in the 70s and 80s shows that employers looked at historical flow. So what that means is that, you know, what sorts of jobs did people usually hold who were moved up into these target jobs? And I would argue that that really disadvantaged a lot of women and minorities who were working in jobs that were occupationally segregated from these more high-paying, high-prestigious jobs. And so when employers would construct these flows, they were really using the traditional ladder of how people ascended into the corporation. And then we want to look at where minorities and women are missing. That's what employers really did, is they formed this model of underutilization. And so the government came to measure affirmative action compliance by looking at underutilization. And what that means is, where are the jobs in the firm that there are not enough women or minorities? And there was absolutely no attention paid to overutilization, which would be, where are the jobs in the firm where there are an overabundance or disproportionate number of minorities and women. And Karen Nussbaum and her group found this quite unfair, that there was lack of attention placed on overutilization. So a quote here from her is, "It seems that a good amount of federal money, company attention, and public attention has focused on progress in hiring women and minorities in occupations where they traditionally have been shut out." But Nussbaum continued, "We in the offices throughout Boston on clerical ladders would like to share in some of the improvement. It's time to re-examine government priorities and see that we move to the top of the list." So this is a generation of women working in clerical positions who feel that affirmative action is not going far enough in reaching into the overutilized jobs and trying to create bridge positions to move women into male-dominated ladders. Another Nussbaum quote is that there should not be a dead-end job for anyone. And so basically, she's calling for a focus on overutilization, not just underutilization in monitoring affirmative action compliance. So I'm running out of time, but I briefly want to just talk about enforcement of affirmative action being actually a sort of lacking in much systematic review. So we often talk about the 80s as a rollback in affirmative action. I would argue that looking at the number of firms that were monitored in the 1970s shows how weak affirmative action was in reality. And one economist has studied that only about 10% of firms with government contracts were actually reviewed. And so I think that the burden really shifts towards the individuals to make sure that regulators come and monitor their agencies, and so the burden on the organization is much lessened, and advocates and lobbyists have to make sure that change happens in their organization. And so 9 to 5 sought to monitor enforcement of affirmative action too, in several ways, some of which were more successful than others. They brought up points like the fact that affirmative action plans were often private, employers wouldn't release them. Women had to file complaints to get the OFCCP to come review their firms. And so the larger point here is that the burden of change is shifted towards the individual workers and away from the organizational burdens of government and employers. And so we all know that President Reagan ends up further weakening affirmative action by trying to rescind Executive Order 11246, and then appointing Clarence Thomas as head of the EEOC, who was not an advocate of affirmative action. So we also get the move from affirmative action to diversity and inclusion programs, which I'm going to have to actually skip over to conclude here, that I would argue that the percentage of women working in low-paid clerical work has not changed very much since the 1970s, and there are still very distinct ladders for clerical and managerial work. So when looking at the nature of workplace feminism, what sorts of successes and failures have we seen? Thank you.
All right, good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. My talk today is about presidents, credit cards, and the U.S. economy. As you all know, presidential portraits adorn our nation's money. But in many of our wallets, paper has long given way to plastic. As credit cards became central to our experience of buying and borrowing in recent decades, we might wonder, were our presidents bothered by the replacement of their forebears on the objects we use as money? Or put another way, how did presidents react to the rise of the credit card economy? We should ask this question not out of concern for executive vanity, but rather because as changing financial practices reshaped the American economy in the post-war era, they also reshaped executive stewardship of that economy. Since World War II, consumption has been the driving force of economic growth in the United States, and credit has long made that consumption possible. Yet credit card lending is different from other forms of borrowing, like mortgages or auto loans, that attach to concrete objects, like houses and cars. As credit card use expanded, cards quickly became symbolic, irresponsible borrowing for individuals and for a nation awash in debt. And in the post-war era, credit card use did nothing but expand. This chart shows outstanding revolving debt, a series compiled by the Federal Reserve that is a close approximation of total credit card debt, and one I'll be using today to illustrate our economy's increasing dependence on credit card borrowing. As you can see, revolving credit grew from almost nothing in the 1960s, in the late 1960s, to more than $1 trillion before the financial crisis of 2008. As wages for middle-class Americans have stagnated since the 1970s, credit cards, I and other scholars argue, have helped fill the gap between the promise of American prosperity and its realization. For better or worse, unsecured borrowing became an essential component of the economy, a fact that presidential administrations had to confront, even as Americans bought with credit cards rather than dead presidents. Today we're going to look at executive credit card policy, what presidents did about credit cards, and also executive credit card rhetoric, how presidents talked about credit cards. For presidents, probably more so than the rest of us, talk really is, or can be, as important as action. So what did this all look like? Like the stages of grief, American chief executives responded to the rise of credit cards through 4 phases. The first was discovery, when, from Eisenhower through Ford, presidents and their administrations came to see credit cards as a new and important mode of finance. The second was confrontation, when Jimmy Carter, because of his own concerns about credit cards' negative effects, sought to slow card growth through federal credit controls. When this action failed, presidents moved to acceptance and even encouragement, realizing they needed consumers to use credit cards to keep the economy afloat. Finally, and most recently, we've come to reevaluation, when presidents rethought the role of credit cards in our nation's economy. We're going to move through these phases together today, looking briefly at some key episodes that shaped or were shaped by the upward trajectory of this chart. Let's start with Eisenhower. I should note actually that revolving debt wasn't collected until the 1960s, so the chart is actually going to begin with Nixon. We'll come back to that. After World War II, the United States experienced rapid economic growth, driven in large part by rising wages, but also boosted by credit purchasing. Americans bought homes with federally insured mortgages, drove to those homes in cars purchased with auto loans, and filled them with appliances and furniture purchased on the installment plan. At the same time, the federal government itself rapidly accumulated its own significant debts. Eisenhower worried that individual and government indebtedness was an unstable foundation for American prosperity. In 1956, he asked the Federal Reserve to investigate whether consumer credit was compatible with stable economic growth. The report was ambivalent, and it came before a major expansion of the credit card industry, which had been a marginal component of the economy up to that point. In 1958, Bank of America, American Express, and J.C. Penney all introduced new large-scale credit card plans. Credit cards quickly became a symbol of reckless credit use, and they provided Eisenhower with a new and powerful metaphor, which he used to attack government deficits. In a speech to Congress in 1961, Eisenhower condemned, quote, government by credit card as dangerous to future economic growth. This was the first time that credit cards entered presidential speech, and we see in Eisenhower an intellectually consistent concern with debt, both from individuals and from the government, as the basis for American prosperity. Americans, though, felt differently. They liked their credit cards. And over the succeeding decades, credit card use increased, and cards became bound up in larger political fights over the role of credit in the U.S. economy. Eisenhower's Democratic successors, Kennedy and Johnson, focused first on making credit safe and worked to regulate the credit card industry by supporting full disclosure of credit costs and by outlawing aggressive card marketing practices. Nixon and Ford administrations, by contrast, focused instead on credit access, first by trying to limit regulations that would slow the growth of the credit card industry, and then trying to expand access to groups like women and minorities who had a hard time getting credit cards in the 1970s. During this period, the presidents themselves had little to say publicly about credit cards, even as they became an important component of consumer purchasing power. Credit card debt expanded significantly under Nixon and Ford, as we see here in the chart, from about $2 billion in January of 1969 to $16 billion 8 years later. The rapid expansion of cards and the prospects for continued growth worried many observers, and that worry would soon spread to the Oval Office. First, I'd like to apologize for this chart. There's a major revision in the data in 1977, which is this spike. But what I want you to focus on is sort of the angle of ascent, how much sort of more steeply it rises after Carter begins his administration. That growth corresponds to the new round of growth in the credit card industry. For the first time, national banks were mailing credit cards all over the country, sparking large-scale competition in the credit card industry. Bank credit card debt, which had grown at 15% from 1974 to 1977, jumped to over 30% in the following 2 years. This expansion of credit card spending, in turn, generated widespread concern that credit cards were contributing to inflation, the central economic problem of the Carter administration. Credit cards let consumers buy before prices went up, creating more demand for scarce goods and putting further upward pressure on prices. As a House Banking Committee staffer told the Los Angeles Times, quote, "We wonder whether the proliferation of credit cards is actually plastic inflation." As cards continued to flood the market, Carter's administration began to consider steps that would stem this tide. As early as 1978, administration officials discussed the possibility of using federal credit controls to rein in credit card buying. For 2 years, the policy went nowhere, primarily because Carter's advisors couldn't figure out how to monitor millions of individual credit card transactions. Then, in January 1980, inflation spiked, and the administration decided it needed to take decisive action. Although the Federal Reserve wanted credit controls to focus on business lending, Carter himself insisted that credit cards remain part of the package. The policy that emerged was complicated, but at their most basic, credit controls made it expensive for credit card firms to lend to consumers. On March 1980, March 14, 1980, Carter announced his credit control policy. He admonished Americans for their irresponsible buying habits. Quote, "Our whole society, the entire American family, must try harder than ever to live within its means. As individuals and as a nation, we must begin spending money according to what we can afford in the long run, not according to what we can borrow in the short run. And I won't attempt Brian's awesome Carter accent, but you can imagine what it's like. Carter, as you may recall, was predisposed to this sort of moralizing. We remember Carter sitting in a sweater telling Americans to turn down their thermostats to save energy. And his concerns about credit cards were rooted in a similar belief that Americans, for the collective good, needed to reform their individually profligate ways. In essence, Carter had also resumed the position staked out by Eisenhower, expressing concern about individual and government borrowing. But while Eisenhower worried about building the post-war prosperity on a foundation of debt, by Carter's term, the edifice had already been built. Nevertheless, consumers saw Carter confronting the credit card economy, and they responded. Some consumers cut up credit cards and mailed them to the White House. One, in a typical letter to Newsweek, wrote, quote, "I'm in full support of Carter's anti-inflationary attack on use of credit cards. I'm glad to see someone has intervened in this craze." By the end of April, the Wall Street Journal reported a robust 70% approval rating for Carter's credit crackdown, while the American Retail Federation found that, quote, "Americans are trying to cut back, have intended to for some time, and foresee a day when they can live their lives in a more manageable economic setting." This was all great news, except that as consumers cut back on card purchasing, the economy began to simultaneously decline. Within the White House, the withdrawal of consumers from credit card spending was met with pleasure. The policy was working, but also dread. The policy was working too well. The president's economic advisors worried that, as one confided, quote, "Many consumers believe the use of credit cards is now illegal or unpatriotic," and he asked if the administration should counter these notions. As consumers turned away from credit and retailers and banks withdrew credit from the market, the White House's fears manifested. As Carter explained to a town hall meeting at Temple University in May of 1980, quote, "We put some constraints on consumer spending, including slight restraint on credit card use. The results have been many times greater than we thought they would be." That was putting it mildly. During the second quarter of 1980, with credit controls fully in effect, gross domestic product declined at an annual rate of 7.9%, then the sharpest decline of the post-war era. Unemployment, on the other hand, rose from 6.3% in March to 7.5% in May, before peaking at 7.8% in July. Consumers were responding very strongly to credit controls. And while they may have wished to cut back and to live their economic lives in a more manageable setting, their lives and the American economy were fully dependent on credit card spending. The economic consequences were bad news for Carter, who I might now remind you was running for president at this time. His opponent, Ronald Reagan, was quick to use the faltering economy against him. In their debate in Cleveland, you may remember Reagan famously closed by asking Americans, "Are you better off than you were 4 years ago?" You may not remember the next question, which was, quote, "Is it easier for you to go buy things in stores than it was 4 years ago?" With controls on credit cards, it certainly was not. Reagan initiated the third stage, what I call acceptance. There we go. The third stage, what I call acceptance and even encouragement, which ran from his presidency through that of George H.W. Bush. As you can see by this chart, in those years, credit card debt went up, way up. Much of this growth was beyond any president's direct control, as innovations in finance and state regulation made it much easier for firms to lend. What was in their control was how they talked about this growth. After Carter, America's presidents encouraged its citizens to go further into debt. For instance, George H.W. Bush urged the credit card industry to make it easier for indebted consumers to keep using their credit cards. In remarks at a fundraising luncheon in November 1991, Bush told attendees, quote, "I'd frankly like to see the credit card rates come down. I believe it would help stimulate the consumer and get consumer confidence moving again." Put another way, Bush hoped that if consumers could spend less on the debts they already had, they might go spend more freely in the economy, likely using the same cards that had put them in debt in the first place. Defending his remarks later the same week, Bush reiterated that he hoped less burdensome consumer debt would, quote, "give this economy a little kick." The kick, though, would not last forever. As I mentioned at the outset, the last stage was reevaluation, rethinking the role of credit card spending in the American economy. Soon after Barack Obama took office in 2009, he declared that, quote, "The days when we are going to be able to grow this economy on an overheated housing market or people maxing out their credit cards, those days are over." And for a while, they were. As you can see, after the financial crisis, credit card debt declined sharply, although it doesn't look that sharp in this graph. There are several reasons for this, not least of which was a major credit card reform law in 2009. But what this chart also shows us is that President Obama may have been wrong, because credit card debt is back on the rise. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and I again would like to thank Mark and Roger and Stephen for organizing this, Zella for all of her excellent work and making it run smoothly, the Larkins for sponsoring this wonderful workshop, and the students and faculty of FAU who've been so welcoming, and the audience for coming out on a Thursday afternoon when you could be enjoying the Florida sun, just sitting listening to us talk about presidents. And I think that's an admirable display of American citizenship. So thank you. When we think about the American presidency, it's easy to slot certain technologies into the narrative we have of what the president embodies, what the position represents. The entire legacy of the United States as a nuclear power is predicated on a series of executive decisions to drop the bomb after the end of World War II. Whistle-stop tours by trains and the romanticization of Air Force One tie in with the technological ascendance of rail and the promise of the jet age. Presidents burnished their reputations in the 20th century by becoming masters of new media technologies, radio, television, the internet. From Jefferson the tinkerer and Lincoln the promoter of land-grant mechanic arts to Hoover and Carter the engineers, Roosevelt and Eisenhower the infrastructure builders, and John F. Kennedy the prophet of rocket ships to the moon, presidents are linked in popular imagination and historical record with the key technological shifts that mark the nation's past. The computer is a bit of a problem in this narrative, though. It doesn't slot very neatly. Electronic computers and modern digital communications, data management, information technology are ubiquitous in modern American society. Most of you in the audience will have miniature computers in your pockets in the form of smartphones. The screen behind me and the lighting and climate control systems of this very auditorium are run by computers. They're an inescapable presence in our modern society. But drawing a through line from the Oval Office to Silicon Valley is not exactly an easy task. When we think about the first true electronic digital computer starting in 1946, the ENIAC in a basement at the University of Pennsylvania, Harry Truman was not in the back room sticking vacuum tubes in. In the 1960s, when President Johnson and Nixon were prosecuting their wars on poverty and the Vietnamese and their enemies lists, they weren't using punch cards to make it possible. Jimmy Carter was not in a garage with Steve Jobs soldering microchips. But you can trace a connection between the presidency and the digital society that has emerged over the past 60, 70 years due to the role that the presidents played in shaping the political and economic context of post-1945 America. And what I'd like to do today is walk you through 5 ways in which the presidents related to the emerging computer economy and society, and show how the occupants of the White House, they may not have been the ones who brought us the smartphone, helped create the environment in which that became possible. The presidency presents a compelling lens, which we can understand how state and capitalism intertwine in creating digital society. The very obscurity of the ways in which the presidency connects to the rise of a digital America reinforces the true role that we see the federal government taking in shaping the digital age. It's structural, it's out of sight, and it's deeply enmeshed with market interests. and changing societal forces. Presidents both help drive this and respond to it. The American president, the occupants of the office, can in no way be described as the progenitor of the electronic computer. But the actions of the American presidents created the environment that made possible the digital age. The first way in which we can see this is presidents take the role as arbiters of the institutional frameworks that create the environments that allow the computer to reach the ascendance it does in modern American society. The computer is born out of the total war of World War II, and it comes into prominence during the Cold War. It's the infrastructure of the Cold War, massive amounts of government funding going into national security and defense that make possible the research and development that creates successive generations of newer, faster, more powerful computers capable of more and more impressive things. We can think about the joke that went around the United States in the 1999-2000 when Leno and Letterman ridiculed then Vice President and presidential candidate Al Gore for his claim that he invented the internet. And it's pretty funny because holders of executive office, presidents and vice presidents, they don't invent computers. Computers are created by entrepreneurs and innovators, right? And presidents are technocrats, not technologists. But there is some truth. Gore was describing his sponsorship of the High Performance Computing Act of 1991. And what he was hinting at is a larger narrative in the sense that the federal government provided the sponsorship and the funding and the structure by which computers are developed and disseminated out through broader culture. If we look at the Truman and Eisenhower administrations, we see the rise of computer-based airplane and missile systems designed to project authority and defend the nation against Soviet attack. In 1957, in his radio address on science and national security, Eisenhower explicitly listed electronic computers as a cornerstone of the Continental Defense System, along with radar, missiles, and the atomic bomb. Yet, 4 years later, in his famous military-industrial complex speech, he cautioned against the hundreds of new electronic computers proliferating throughout the Pentagon and the defense infrastructure, warning that we should be watchful lest they take away from human authority over the ultimate questions of national defense. Concurrently, as we move from the 50s into the 1960s, expansion of the welfare state and growth of domestic policymaking and regulatory concerns fueled dissemination of computer technologies throughout non-military agencies and governmental divisions. Computers created as naval targeting aids go from overseeing nuclear deterrence to processing payrolls, cutting government checks, managing inventory. By the late 1950s, President Eisenhower has to commission a survey to find out exactly how many computers are operating in the federal government and what they're doing. As time progresses, we find that the relationship between government contractors who supply, lease, maintain computers, and train personnel to use them reflects the growing contractor state in general and the relationship between those independent private market interests that fuel much of government activity. In that way, the computer is very emblematic of this new post-war state. And it's both broadly expansive goals in national security and in social welfare, and the tenuous back and forth relationship it has with private sector contractors who make much of that expansion possible. Year after year, presidents submit budget requests to Congress. Congress may have the power of the purse, but presidents do oversee the budget and define the administrative goals of the executive branch. And so presidential decisions as we move from Truman to Eisenhower to Kennedy to Johnson encourage and foster an environment in which computers become more and more prominent as tools of policy making. presidents are willing to request money for computers in their budgets, and they're willing to accede to the requests of their secretaries and governmental officials who seek computers to process information and expand the reach of the policies that their agencies and departments oversee. This leads us to the second element in which presidents play a role. Again, we've said they're arbiters of institutional frameworks. Because of the proliferation of computers that they sponsor by creating these institutional frameworks, they become promoters of computers as tools for policy problem solving. We've established that computers are a major part of the backbone of the Cold War national security apparatus, but they fuel huge swaths of domestic policy as time progresses as well. In fact, by the late 1960s, the American Association for the Advancement of Science heralds the Johnson administration for, quote, an increasing devotion to the systematic use of information in public and private decision-making, as is exemplified by the President's Council of Economic Advisors. Economic policy making, social security, new government agencies centered on transportation and urban development all have at their core giant mainframe computers processing data that will fuel the policy decision-making affecting the lives of millions of Americans. As more and more Americans turn to government service, encouraged by President Kennedy and the expanding federal bureaucracy of the Johnson years, they are trained in public policy programs and in government certification programs run through the Department of Agriculture, among others, that specialize in systems thought, rooted in using computers and associated methodologies to solve problems. Presidential policy priorities in the 60s and the 70s come to be framed in terms of computers as devices that can make possible simplification of complex questions. They allow you to take a range of data, input it, and receive a result that can be presented to a budget committee, a congressional delegation, or the press, or the American public as potential policy solutions. Even foreign policy in the Nixon administration is influenced to a degree, as President Nixon and his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, discuss ways of using computers to process information to better understand America's diplomatic standing. Nixon even sends a team of computer scientists over to China shortly after he sends ping pong players over to show the strength of the United States as an information processing power. By the time we get to the 1990s and the Clinton-era welfare reforms, the Federal Welfare to Work Hiring Initiative, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the Office of Personnel Management, all see computerized employment and job training skills as ways of furthering the president's social welfare reform agenda. What had been an obscure, specialized tool by the 50s, by the 1990s becomes an essential part of internal communications, management, and policy implementation in the executive branch. So much so that in 1993, on the first day of the Clinton administration, Clinton staffers are surprised when they arrive at the White House to find that special counsel Joseph DeGenova, who had been investigating George H.W. Bush, had removed all of the computers from the White House and the executive office building as part of his investigation. Their first day on the job, there had actually no computers in the White House itself to do any of the work and the grand ambitions that they had planned. It's just a telling example of how computers become increasingly proximate to the president and the people doing work for him. This leads us to the third point, that of government reorganization. Presidents find computers as very useful tools for implementing reform and restructuring of federal agencies. We see this in the late 1940s and early 1950s with the Hoover Commission under the Truman and Eisenhower administrations. We see it in the 1960s when President Johnson adopts the Programming, Policy, budgeting system proposed by his Defense Secretary, Robert McNamara, and applies it to the majority of the executive branch. We see it in the 1970s when Richard Nixon brings in that era's equivalent of a tech official, Roy Ash, to run his Office of the Budget. Presidents see computers as impartial tools of creating more efficient government, streamlining the bureaucracy, and pushing through their agendas. They embrace computers so much so that this leads to the fourth point of presidential relationship to computers. Presidents become evangelists for a digital future. They may not know much about technology themselves, but they see technology as a way of achieving economic growth in the United States. And they promote computers as tools to sell American ingenuity, to further the economy, and repair some of the damage done by deindustrialization beginning in the 1970s. President Reagan, in particular, as former governor of a state with deep technology interests, was very fond of promoting computers as a panacea to the to issues with the American economy and as a route to the American dream. He presents the National Medal of Technology to Steve Jobs. He goes to the Soviet Union and speaks to graduates in 1988 of the Soviet Institute of Technology and points out the future will be an information revolution and American companies, American innovators will be leading the way. This leads us to the final way in which presidents use computers, and it comes full circle, where once they created the environment, presidents now use computers to campaign and to respond to specific technology-related policies. We can see this in the 2008, 2012 elections, and for the foreseeable future, computers will become central to the identity of president as candidate and president as office holder. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Before I begin, I would, of course, like to echo the thank yous given by my fellow panelists. I would also like to tell the audience that those of us who are visiting here have been so well treated. We have been so impressed. You should be very proud to be associated with FAU. In the mid-20th century, private retirement plans operated at the discretion of employers, many of whom still regarded the pension as a gift granted to long-serving employees as a return for their loyal service, the proverbial gold watch. In the absence of comprehensive federal legislation, employees had no guarantee that the pensions they expected would be paid. By the late 60s, many workers were forced to face the prospect of post-work life, either without retirement funds or with drastically less than they had been led to expect. In 1971, President Richard M. Nixon proposed legislation that would become part of the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, ERISA, landmark legislation that changed American private retirement practices. Nixon proposed to allow individuals to create their own retirement accounts. This became the individual retirement account, commonly known as the IRA. At a moment that federal lawmakers spoke volubly about devolving authority away from Washington, D.C., ERISA's authors preempted state retirement legislation. Creation of the IRA, now a cornerstone of modern retirement planning, demonstrates the presence of an often decisive presidential hand in policymaking. ERISA encouraged Americans to believe that they alone bore responsibility to finance their retirement. In truth, retirement within the American version of capitalism was both intimately personal and increasingly corporate. Now, in the early 20th century, retirement was an unhappy situation forced upon those too enfeebled to continue working. The fundamental characteristic of early pensions was that the choice of how long to work was a decision made by the company, not by the worker. The key element of control was a compulsory retirement age. By replacing older, higher wage employees with entry-level workers, firms could achieve significant savings. The New Deal embraced the insistence of pension reformers that every worker should have some form of guaranteed old age security. Creation of Social Security legitimized the idea of retirement by acknowledging the necessity of financial support. So provision for old age became a social requirement. The idea of retirement as a period of well-deserved leisure after a lifetime of work was an ideology that really developed after World War II. Insurance companies promoted retirement as a period for life to be enjoyed, courtesy of the pensions they sold. Unions pushed to expand pension coverage by including pensions in collective bargaining. The elderly themselves found it necessary to remain active in order to qualify for health insurance. As retirement became a permanent vacation, retired persons discovered they had time to buy and enjoy consumer goods, and the manufacturers of those goods found a new and potentially very profitable market. There's a catch. There's always a catch. Free time isn't really free. In 1958, Americans spent more than $60 million on golf equipment. To put that into perspective, adjusting for inflation, in today's money, that's about $500 million. That's a lot of golf clubs. By 1960, retirement was the pinnacle of the American dream. Pensions were necessary to pay for it. Traditionally, the money for pensions had been invested with insurance companies. But as the stock market boomed in the 60s, many companies moved their pensions to financial institutions, such as investment companies or trust foundations, trading their safe insurance plans for riskier, but potentially much more profitable, stock investment. By the end of the 60s, institutions controlled half of all outstanding common shares. As pension funds collectively grew into billions of dollars, politicians began to pay a lot more attention. The faults of private pensions became obvious as the combined wars on poverty and in Vietnam produced rapid inflation and general economic unrest. The shift of pension money away from safe insurance into risky stocks was eroding the stability that was demanded by a traditional pension. As the right to an enjoyable retirement became an extension of the right to an American standard of living, federal pension regulation became not only legitimized, but required. Congress recognized retirement had become a collective social promise, and that Americans had nowhere to turn when that promise was broken. Accepting that provision for retirement is a social responsibility of business, and that business plays a vital role in society that extends beyond its function as a conduit of shareholder returns. The question becomes the extent to which pensions should be subject to regulation. Members of Congress needed 12 years to answer that question. When Richard Nixon became president in 1968, he was not particularly interested in pension reform. For that matter, he wasn't really interested in domestic policy. What he was interested in, though, was issues that might lure blue-collar workers to vote Republican, and that's where pensions come in. Meanwhile, in Congress, Senators Jacob Javits, a liberal Republican from New York, and Harrison Williams, Democrat from New Jersey, had combined forces on the Senate Labor Committee to create their own comprehensive reform bill, the Williams-Javits bill. With help from such people as consumer activist Ralph Nader, the senators used the media to rally support for their proposal. With nationwide publicity and billions of dollars involved, the administration had to take part in the debate. At the same time, Nixon was not oblivious to the fact that Senator Williams was stealing his thunder. In early '71, Nixon charged senior advisor Peter Flanagan, former investment banker, with creation of an interagency task force to put together new pension reform legislation. The administration couldn't support increased cost of business, but it could support a method by which workers could become better prepared for retirement on an individual basis. When Flanagan presented the task force recommendations later that year, the centerpiece was the individual retirement account. The IRA embodied President Nixon's intention that, I quote Flanagan, individuals be encouraged in the American tradition of helping individuals to help themselves. By August of '72, Nixon had grown impatient with these seemingly endless pension debates. Flanagan cautioned him that any action might be seen as support for the Williams-Javits bill. To get around that, the administration turned to the Senate Finance Committee, which held jurisdiction over taxes, an integral component of reform. Powerful finance chair Russell Long of Louisiana was adamant that the Labor Committee not usurp his jurisdiction, and after a week of closed-door deliberations, the Finance Committee struck every key provision from the bill. Senator Williams angrily blamed Nixon, but the accusation was hard to support when Democrats controlled the Senate. With reform so visibly stymied in Congress, many states began developing their own proposals for pension legislation. The fear of a nationally fragmented system forced the business community to support federal legislation, reinvigorating Williams-Javits. At the same time, finance decided to create their own bill. This benefited the administration because one of the senators working on the bill was Texas Democrat Lloyd Benson, who was protege of former Texas Governor John Connally, who was one of very few people whom Nixon actually respected. He made him Treasury Secretary in late 1970 and even considered him for vice president. When Senator Benson introduced the finance bill, he addressed fears of the possibility of a government takeover of private pensions, some kind of super social security. Business feared both the growth of federal bureaucracy and the potential loss of control by the private sector. The finance bill emphasized that the main idea was to change the tax code in such a way that people would be encouraged to save for their own retirement. The purpose of reform was to help the free enterprise system operate more effectively. In its infinite wisdom, the Senate combined the finance bill with the Williams-Javits bill and began debating on it in late 1973 and then promptly stopped debate. At any other period in history, this would have signaled the death of the bill, but the fact of the matter was Congress had bigger fish to fry in late 1973. President Nixon was not paying much attention to domestic policy. Congressional leaders, worried that impeachment hearings would bump ERISA consideration until the next Congress, pushed hard to get the final bill ready before Congress became embroiled in the Watergate hearings. They managed to get it passed, and new President Gerald Ford signed ERISA into law on Labor Day, 1974. From the beginning, ERISA was really confusing. Employers reacted with extreme caution. Many companies had trouble finding people to manage their pensions because no one would take the job until Congress clarified the responsibilities. Pension management became an issue of avoiding failure more than achieving success. Most of ERISA's regulations applied to what we think of as a traditional pension. This is what's known as a defined benefit pension, where employees know how much they're going to get when they retire. After ERISA, many companies changed to a defined contribution pension, which is where the amount they put in to begin with is defined, but the eventual outcome is uncertain. These kinds of plans gave employers a way to subvert ERISA. What Congress did not foresee was how new regulation of retirement and concurrent changes at the stock exchange would drive employers and stockbrokers to promote retirement planning as an individual rather than corporate responsibility. Easier access to investing for individuals meant that corporations could justify shifting their retirement responsibility to their employees. The IRA was never intended to be an escape route for companies to shrug off their pension responsibilities, although some did use it that way. Initially, the IRA was most important conceptually. It gave government sanction to the idea of self-directed, self-controlled retirement planning. Growth began very slowly, with $3 billion invested in 1975, but now totals over $7 trillion. By divesting themselves of the operations of their pensions, corporations turned over a measure of their power to the financial institutions now doing the investing for them. In order to exercise that power, these institutions are dependent on having a market in which to operate, which is what the New York Stock Exchange provides. This is one reason why American retirement planning remains so very dependent on the success of the stock market. However, there remains a crucial difference between investing through a 401k versus an IRA. For those of you who have not had the pleasure of signing up for a 401k, you are permitted to make choices, but the list of things you can choose from is still constrained by decisions made by your employer. With Nixon's IRA, though, the retirement choices of individuals are placed in their own hands. Thank you.
I want to thank all of the panelists for offering such insightful and very interesting panel papers for us today. So we're going to open this up to audience questions and answers. So we have microphones up on both sides of the stage. So if you want to come up and ask your question from the microphone. And while people start to filter up, I'll kick things off by asking the first question. There's a lot of questions I want to ask of the individual panelists, but I think I'm going to go for a bigger conceptual question here. And that has to do with the fact that I noticed that in each of your sectors of the economy, the president seems to have more power or less power in controlling gender equality or trying to influence credit cards or retirement planning or the use of computers. So I wanted to ask all of you how you saw the nature of presidential power here. Do you think the president has a lot of influence on the segment of the economy that you're looking at or not? And why would that be important to think about? So whoever wants to start off, Paula? Yeah, sure, yeah.
In a way, I would say that Nixon's power when it came to retirement was almost accidental. Congress was working off the idea that retirement pensions would stay the same forever. They thought the defined benefit way was permanent. So the proposal of the IRA was really no big deal. They thought nobody would ever use it. So I kind of really get the feeling that, sure, we can let that stay in the bill. No problem, whatever. If it makes you happy, we're good. And that was it. But it wasn't, you must do this.
Well, when it comes to computers, the president's played two roles. One is sort of out of sight in that they oversee the executive branch, which is the federal government is the largest buyer and user of computers in the world. And that's been the case for the past 50 years. So the presidents may not have actively fostered the computer industry, but they didn't hinder it either by sponsoring huge government contracts and creating an environment in which federal employees felt comfortable seeking out the use of computers. And additionally, presidents serve as proselytizers. When President Obama visits a factory in Silicon Valley, well, there aren't many factories left in Silicon Valley, but he visits a software company in Silicon Valley and talks about the digital future of America and its innovators, that's very strong language that filters through the rest of society.
Yeah, I mean, as I sort of began the talk, I think there's presidential policy, so efforts to influence often congressional policy, where presidents play a sort of minor role. I think Carter's example is kind of, is particularly outstanding because he had specific powers under something called the Credit Control Act of 1969, which enabled him to use or to institute credit controls, and that power was revoked actually before he even got out of office. So you can see that Congress really didn't like that very much. But I think what's equally important here, and this goes a lot to what Professor Ballo talked about in his keynote address, if you were fortunate enough to be here when he gave that yesterday, is this idea that the president, through his actions in sort of talking about the credit card economy and trying to promote prosperity in a world where prosperity comes through credit, not through wages, has a large role in actually shaping how Americans sort of imagine their place in the economy and what correct action in that economy looks like. And this also goes to some things Brent said earlier as well. So there are definitely two sort of big roles to play, policy and then also sort of presidential speech.
I would say the industries I've mostly looked at are banking and insurance companies, and I would think that the executive orders of affirmative action did push employers to make some changes, but they were quite vague, and so a sociologist has written an interesting book on how employers actually did a lot of the specifications of what affirmative action would come to mean.
I was talking about two separate arenas, and obviously the president has total control over the members of his cabinet, although, as I mentioned, the president is subject to a number of incentives in those decisions, just as with any other decision. So political capital means a lot there. In terms of corporate CEOs, it's quite a different situation. And in business, there are two kinds of discrimination. One of them is what I call push discrimination, which is excluding people from opportunity. And presidents have an enormous amount of authority in that. And so, for example, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and then various things that presidents have done to enforce that, has argued against, or has made push discrimination, excluding discrimination, illegal, which of course doesn't take it away, but it at least makes it illegal. And so individuals, such as what Allison was talking about, can act. On the other hand, there is no law possible, at least not in the United States. European Union has quotas, but in this country, I can't imagine there being any kind of a quota for whether it's executive boards or CEOs, and that requires pull, and you can't force someone to mentor anyone else. You can't force someone to be a gatekeeper pulling people up a ladder if you don't want to do it. I mean, you can put a half-hearted effort into it. But in terms of actually forcing people to be mentors and positive gatekeepers, it's just not something that's subject to law in this country.
Thank you. So do we have questions from the audience? Okay.
Hi. So I have three questions. First for Paula. Okay, this is, you may have covered this, so if you did, I apologize for sort of repeating or forcing you to cover the same ground. But it seems like the the issue of the pension for Nixon is motivated less by what you're saying is any interest in pensions per se, but a need to attract these blue-collar workers to the silent majority. What was, in terms of Williams and Javits, what was motivating them at that particular time?
There's actually a pretty good-sized historiographical debate about that. The person who's written the most about ERISA is a fellow named James Wooten, who's a political scholar. And his opinion is that they really just wanted to do the right thing for people. They really wanted to do this out of the goodness of their hearts. They thought it would be very helpful.
So is there anything at that moment that's happening to indicate that something needs to be done in the early 1970s?
Well, yes, and this is the more realistic approach. The problem is what's happening with the money that pensions are investing. They're giving it to these institutions who are taking it to the stock market. At this point, the cost to trade a stock is a set. It's not negotiable. So by trading these giant blocks of stock, institutions are racking up huge commission bills on the stock exchange. And they're very mad about that, so they're leaving the New York Stock Exchange, which is making the entire capital market much less transparent. Some of these institutions are going to regional exchanges, but what was really worrying to Congress was that some of them were going to what was called the third market, which was trading of listed securities off the exchange, which is something that's not supposed to happen. And that was really behind closed doors. So we have almost $200 billion, and nobody really knows where it is. And that was the much more practical reason. That and the fact that Congress was not comfortable with any other institution besides itself being able to control that much of the economy.
You know, it's become a modern myth that the computer industry was created in garages by hero capitalists, when in fact it was created by the government. And this has been a continual pattern in American history of kind of corporations that basically owe their existence and huge amounts of money to the government, who then create these huge fortunes. Often don't do very much, corporations, or they go broke, but they, in the process, create huge corporations and people who then think they know how to run the government, and then present themselves as these kind of business heroes. We have one in Palm Beach here, who's a business hero, who's going to then tell the government what to do because he's a successful businessman. And this, the Fiorina campaign is interesting in that regard because she missed the boat entirely. She could have tried to present herself as the future, as the voice of, technology and all that. Instead, she went, she didn't do that. She went after Hillary Clinton without saying this politics that's developed around the computer industry that thinks it knows how to run the government and now has these young billionaires who want to put it into practice. So I wonder if you could comment on how that other piece, the government-created power of capital, has come back from the computer industry to government.
Well, I'm glad you're interested in that topic, and I hope you keep an eye out for my book in a couple of years, as it addresses some of the deep history of those questions. This, as you pointed out, is a recurring theme in American history. In fact, our speaker yesterday, Brian Ballo, put out a book a few years ago that looks at the out-of-sight ways in which the federal government has sponsored large sectors of the economy in the past, canals, railroads, things along those lines. When it comes to computer technology, I think the president's role of proselytizer plays a major part here. And the presidents constantly berate the efficiency of the federal bureaucracy, and they bring in external consultants, whether they're technology executives or specialists from the RAND Corporation, and the solutions always involve some bright new shiny technology to remake government efficiency. And sometimes that's effective and sometimes it's not. But the deep roots go back to this mistrust of large government at the same time that we expect the services that a large government provides. And computers seem like a neutral tool to provide those services without the messiness of a political overlay.
Over here, Dr. Bennett.
I'm not sure this will be the most coherent question, but I'm trying to come up with one that sort of crosses the boundaries. And what I see here is an interesting question of how citizenship is envisioned, whether that's through affirmative action policy or easier access to credit, which is now seen as a right of a citizen, or the sort of digital citizenship that we're in, or this notion of controlling your own destiny as a significant part of citizenship. How do you see the developments in each of your respective fields as sort of mapping against the transformations and the notions of citizenship coming out of the New Deal and into sort of a, for lack of a better term, a neoliberal world? How do you see those tracking, or what in your each field, I guess?
Sam,
who would like to
or do you
start?
want me to start?
Yes, if you want me to start.
In terms of retirement, I think there's still very much the idea that you are entitled to a decent retirement. And I really certainly hope that's the case. But the thing that always strikes me as problematic is, yes, we're giving individuals this control of their own destiny, as you say, but how many of these people are we actually training to be able to do that? We send English majors out into the world with no idea what a 401k is, let alone what their investment mix should be. So I think we're giving citizens much more responsibility, but we're letting them down by not giving them the tools to exercise that responsibility.
I think there are sort of two representative periods that get at aspects of your question of citizenship. In the Great Society, Lyndon Johnson and his advisors, particularly in the Department of Education and Welfare, saw computers as means of tackling complex issues that had thwarted previous political efforts, namely the urban crisis and eliminating poverty. And they thought they could achieve real ends for citizens using those technologies. In the 1990s, Bill Clinton and his National Partnership for Reinventing Government saw e-government as the solution. And the idea is that you put all information online and make it accessible to ordinary citizens, and they'll understand how their government works, and everything will be open and transparent. And those are both very lofty goals, but they didn't quite work out.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe to try to reduce it a little bit, with the New Deal, we have a sort of productive citizenship that's built around work and labor. And even the credit programs that come out of the New Deal are geared towards buying things like houses, which are the product of well-paid, often white male jobs. And I'd say even into the beginning of the 50s, there's the rise of maybe a financial citizenship that's tied into a larger sort of consumerist identity that, again, Professor Ballot talked about yesterday, but I think ties both Paul and I's papers together, which is now as a financial citizen, you should have access to whatever kind of credit you think you can manage, whether or not you're trained to do that. You should have, oversight of your retirement. And so the sort of rise of that financial citizenship is a way to then think about the larger story of the rise of the financial services industry that starts in the 70s and 80s as being rooted sort of in a deeper period.
I think that affirmative action policy in this, sort of small narrative I shared really shows the tension that, I guess had always existed but was particularly prominent in the 1970s between the individual responsibility to be successful. So, depending on how much money you made or where you were in society, that was a result of your individual choices versus organizations and larger institutions having a resportsibility to bring people up and to create opportunities for growth of those who, sort of lacked the mobility.
One of the interesting aspects of that question is the larger question is, what does it mean to be a citizen? And women have had the right to vote in national elections for almost a century. And presidents have been slow to recognize the relevance of political representation in their cabinets in these very high-profile, symbolic positions. But they have, and so the citizenship as voters has mattered. In terms of corporations, what does it mean to be a citizen? It means nothing, in essence. And it's really, and this is one of the reasons why I think the process of integrating women and underrepresented minorities into corporations is just going to take a whole lot longer, because there is no such thing as citizen rights within corporations.
Great. I think we have time for one more question from Dr. Ballo.
This one is for Sean specifically, but it, I think, gets at a theme that has come up a number of times in the conference so far. I was wondering if you could say a few words about the links, if any, between the rise of personal credit and its consequences, and on the other hand, national debt and its consequences. I'd say maybe half the papers presented so far have dealt with one or the other, and I'd love to hear you discuss whether there's a link there or not.
I think it's a great question. We heard a lot in the last panel about budget deficits for the federal government, and I found myself thinking, when you put those next to budget deficits at the household level and the huge amount of consumer debt, the numbers become that much more startling. I think it's harder to maybe pin down any kind of causal connection. I think there's probably a culture of credit that sort of both, is this whistling? Not recently. Let's not talk about that. I think, so there's this idea that in households we see escalating debt, and there don't seem to be, there are consequences for individuals, but the economy continues to flourish. And the same thing seems to happen at the government level. I think it was maybe Cheney who said deficits don't matter. And maybe there's a feedback loop where, you know, one can look at the other, and the metaphor of the government as, you know, a household that needs to balance its books doesn't really make sense when households themselves are no longer balancing their books. So I think, you know, sort of pinning that as sort of a causal link is hard, but I think the culture of indebtedness and being willing to take on these large financial obligations runs between the state and individuals. And probably, you know, you could probably see the same thing at state and local government levels as well. So.
Thank you all. So let's give the participants here another round of applause. So please stick around. We're taking a 15-minute break, but there is another panel that will follow this afternoon. So we'll resume at 3.
Good.